thriving in business and life. My name is Will Wilkinson.
And I'm Christopher Harding, and we're picking up on our last section on the virus of bias.
We must be infected ourselves. We keep returning here. Actually, it's such a big topic. That's why we're doing it.
Yeah, we'll say that instead of saying it's a relapse.
Exactly.
So one of the things that we explore when we're within organizations is, as soon as you start to raise the topic of bias, and we've said this before because people have a predisposition or a bias, I guess you could say, that biases are bad, everybody's a little bit shy to acknowledge that they maybe are vulnerable to biases themselves.
Who, me?
Yeah, exactly. So you and I have both talked about this. I mean, you recognize you have biases.
Well, I recognize I have some biases, but I have to say, working with you, because this is such a major field of study for you, that I'm becoming more alert to the biases I have that I didn't know I had. I think that's a major point. The minute we become aware of this, it's like our antenna starts tuning for those biases, and we start seeing more and more of them.
Right. And so one way, for us and our listeners to double check themselves is just ask yourself, have you ever heard biases about women? Have you ever heard biases about African Americans or other people of color or other ethnic groups or, people who are Caucasian? Have you heard biases about men or engineers or, name the group? Have you ever heard biases about them? I think most of us would have to say yes, right?
Well, I sure have to say yes. I've heard them, and sad to say, I've uttered them.
So that's, I think, true of all of us. We've heard them. We've probably either knowingly or unknowingly passed them along, recited them. But here's a thing that runs a little deeper, just so we understand our vulnerability. If I've heard it, or if you've heard it, then whose mind did it get recorded in?
Exactly.
Yeah. And if it's in there, regardless of how it got there, whose inventory is that to manage now?
That's such an amazing point, because we often discount just hearing something and say, well, that's what someone else said. But as you say, now it's inside me. I guess then the question I'd ask you on behalf of our listeners, what do we do about it?
Well, so if I recognize that I have that vulnerability, what I'm going to start to do is just pay attention to what I say or what I think. Just catch the first couple of thoughts when somebody comes into the room, or if I hear somebody say something and I feel kind of a negative reaction or a defensive reaction. It's just notice, what was the thought that came up? Wow, was that a bias? Is it true? It might be true about someone, but is it true in this situation?
In other words, some real vigorous self-inquiry.
Right. Yeah,
Well,
it's that first couple of seconds that go by.
Yeah, and that's the Socratic way. He said the unexamined life isn't worth living.
Right. Yeah, so it is. It is, I guess you could say, one could say it's a discipline. I prefer to make it a game because sometimes I bristle at discipline.
You're one of the very few.
Yeah, it's kind of in my nature to be have a little bit of a pushback on that.
Well, I think most of us do, and the phrase that I like is nobody likes to be should upon. You should do this, you should do that. If it's a duty, likely we're not going to do it that long.
Right.
So you're making a game out of it in line with what we write about in the book, flipping the script on your life, writing a new story. I like that a lot. A game is far more appealing than a duty.
Yeah, it's far more fun, and it allows me to really be curious. Just even be curious about what's in my own mind. What made it in there? What's hiding behind the corner that sometimes will pop out when I least expect it. And then if I know that, and if I own that society's beliefs are also in my head, that means society's beliefs are also mine.
Fascinating. Well, I really appreciate the nuanced approach to this, starting from the point where biases are not categorically bad. So in the self-examination, it's really looking for the shades, the tones, the qualities that are there that don't belong, and the ones that we maybe can learn something from. Because as you've said before, there are biases that we need. They're not all bad.
Well, yeah. I mean, you've given the example of driving, I mean, I don't want to have to be examining every single piece of data that comes in. Just walking around in life, our brain is constantly exercising shortcuts that are helpful. So really what we're looking for is what are the shortcuts that the brain exercises because of the programming that it has
Right.
that are actually limiting our thinking or limiting how we see someone else or the possibilities in a certain situation.
Well, let's apply this to our relationships, because I know a lot of your work in the corporate world has been team building.
Right.
And helping teams recognize where they're biased, releasing it, being more inclusive of diversity. So would you mind saying a little bit more about that? So I think that's very practical.
Well, so one of the common ones that comes up a lot, I work with a lot of firms, as you know, that are engineering-based, science-based, and then they also have a marketing wing. And as soon as you start to get the marketing department interacting sometimes with the development department, which is very often engineers who are now going to take a concept and bring it into reality, they have some real interesting biases about each other.
Mm-hmm.
The marketing people sometimes will have a belief, a bias you could say, that the engineers are not practical, that they're just kind of like nerds focused on the schematics and so on, and the engineers think that the marketing people are out there making promises that can't be kept.
Yeah.
Well, you can already see if that's the climate that exists, then how well are they going to listen to each other?
Mm-hmm.
How well will they really be able to have the marketing department bring its market research to the engineering department, and have the engineering department bring their ideas and join together to come up with a product that could be better than any?
Well, I remember graphically a sign in a TV station where I worked in my 30s. It said, "At some point in the course of every project, it's necessary to shoot the engineers and begin production."
Oh, yeah. Well, there you go.
That was it right there. The bias about engineers tweaking things forever and never shipping.
Right, right. Yeah. So that would fit with with some of the ones I've heard. In thinking about that too, here's a bias that I've seen exist, and a lot of companies are now trying to work their way through this, and that is that women don't make good engineers. That's been a long-standing bias, and even still, though people are aware, it's they're in the unconscious.
Right.
So when they're out looking for engineering recruits out of engineering schools, they're very often leery of choosing women because somehow they think they won't make good engineers.
Right, and that comes to bear even in looking at job applications, correct?
Right.
Looking at the name, identifying male or female, and the bias kicks in.
Right, yeah, without even knowing it.
Yeah.
And we talked about bias panels or bias monitors, why they have those. So a lot of times what happens is there's, the one way to start to get through that is to invite departments, marketing, engineering, whoever it might be, to double check their bias and go, well, wait a minute.
Mm-hmm.
If I believe that engineers aren't market driven and don't understand the market, then I'm going to look for evidence to confirm that.
Mm-hmm. Right.
But what if I decide to intentionally set that aside?
Mm-hmm.
And what we're talking about is a model that was introduced to me by Dr. Bill Guillory, and it's called the state of mind diagram. And it basically, if you imagine 3 boxes going horizontally across the page, or the screen in your mind,
Okay.
and you can make them whatever color you want.
Oh, good. I'm going to have fun with this. It sounds like a game, so I'm in.
All right. So the first box, choose your color, is called the state of mind, and that is made up of your mindset, your attitudes, your beliefs, both conscious and unconscious. And what's in that box drives the next box, which is our behavior, the
Right.
things we do, the things we don't do.
Mm-hmm.
And
So the way we think and believe determines how we behave.
Exactly.
Right.
Yeah. Beautifully said.
Got it. Simple formula so far.
Yeah. And then how we behave determines the outcome.
Right.
So
how we think determines how we behave determines the outcome.
right.
1, 2, 3.
Yeah, and if I'm unhappy with the outcome, what's the source of the problem?
Mm-hmm. I know where you're going with this.
A lot of people will look back at the next box and say the behavior.
Yeah, change the behavior.
Right, change the behavior. That's called first order change, right? And it's a temporary fix, you could say. But if my mindset is still, has some limiting belief in there, then even though I'm changing my behavior, I'm still looking my brain is sorting for the problem to still exist.
Yeah. Yeah, well, the example that comes to mind, being a prior smoker, is the challenge of quitting smoking. So the doctor tells you you're going to die of lung cancer if you don't quit smoking. So you go to the behavior, I'll quit smoking. But what's the mindset that caused you to become a smoker? If that's not addressed, it's very, very difficult to quit the behavior of smoking.
So what was it for you?
You know, I'm not sure it ever got completely conscious. It was kind of comfort, you know, like after a meal. Have a cup of coffee, light up a cigarette, or you go to a bar, you have a drink in one hand, a cigarette in the other. It was all about comfort, and as I can see now, distraction. It was not facing certain things in my life that I wasn't willing to face then. Now, what's ironic is after having tried to quit smoking 7, 8 times with no luck whatsoever, one day I read a health magazine, and I kind of woke up to the whole idea of being healthy. And I had a sinus condition and various health problems. And I went, I think I want to be healthy. And I stopped smoking, and I actually didn't even realize that had happened. I came to my senses when a friend offered me a cigarette, and I said, I don't smoke.
Wow, that's interesting. Well, you know, if you take that and apply it to the situation we were just describing, and let's say the marketing department or someone in the marketing department says, I want to really team up with the engineers. I think they're fantastic. How they start to behave and show up and respond is completely different.
Yeah.
Now, sometimes the engineers might be kind of like, what's up with this person? Because it's not the normal dance.
Right.
But if I consistently continue to hold that mindset and behave accordingly, what'll happen is other people will start to learn how to do the new dance.
So I think you called it second order change?
Right.
Going back to the thinking, the mindset, and making a change there rather than just starting with the behavior.
Right, and if I look at the outcome and say, what's the outcome I want? What's the outcome we need? What mindset do I need to even make that possible? Now, based on that mindset, what would I do or not do that would support that outcome? You know,
you're reminding me of something a mentor of mine said many years ago. He said, relative to this whole idea of making changes in your life, he said, ask the question, who would I need to be to have that experience? Or what kind of person would I need to be to have that experience? And he was getting at the mindset.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, and getting at the story too.
Right.
Right. So, and this is the thing where we have stories about ourselves and about the world and so on. I have a really wonderfully talented friend. She's an amazing singer-songwriter. She recently won an award at a national songwriting summit. And yet she still is, lacking confidence because her story of how she grew up has it difficult for her to accept that she's gifted. And that when people come to hear her, they come to experience the gift. And it's still in conflict with her story about who she is. So when she has some concerts coming up soon, and she's concerned. She has this fear of, wow, I'm so nervous about going out there, and it becomes sometimes quite paralyzing for her. So, over time, hopefully what will happen is she'll be able to ask herself, who would I need to be in order to confidently step into this room and share this gift with people in a way that my anxiety and fear isn't getting in the way.
Well, let's get to the how, because the what, we're presenting. What's the how? I mean, for that person, they have what I call false humility. And I've certainly had my measure of that too, where, they're doing something great, someone thanks them, and inside they kind of shrink away from the praise.
Right.
Because they don't really believe in themselves the way another person believes in them. So how does a person get over that? I'm betting that many of our listeners can relate to this exact thing.
Right, and really what we're talking about here is a self-bias, right? And it's every bit as important to understand our biases about ourselves as it is to understand the biases we might have about others. So I'm really glad we're going down this road. So one of the things, I'll use my example. I had that, what you are referring to as false humility. And really when I look at it, it was my, I would say my ego's attempt to keep me within the safe realm that I was still alive. And so being small seemed safe. So the very first thing I had to do, just in terms of compliments, and I had a couple of friends that just would call me on this, and somebody would give me an acknowledgement, and I'd go, oh, well, so-and-so helped me do this. I deflect it. And they stopped me one time and went, why are you cheating people out of giving you a compliment?
Wow.
Why would you do that to somebody?
Wow.
Did you watch their face when they gave you praise and you basically, pooped on their compliment?
Well, you were shortchanging them.
Yeah. And so it really kind of struck me. And so they said, listen, your only answer needs to be thank you.
Well, that's a kind of a good discipline.
Yeah.
Just to adopt it. Did you do that?
I did and still do. And at first, actually for probably months, I really had to consciously catch the deflection before I said it and say thank you.
Well, I'm remembering an experience I had with this exact matter years ago in my 30s. I ran a healing clinic up in Victoria, Canada. And as an experiment, we did it on a contributive basis. I'd read about doctors who tried this, and so we never charged fees, just received donations, contributions. The first few months were torture. I had no problem giving, but I'll tell you, receiving, someone would hand me like $100 or something. And I would feel myself shrinking from their gift until I woke up to exactly what you're saying. So my bias was that I was really good giving, but there was something about receiving that I was against. I just had a bias against that for whatever reason.
Somebody referred to me one time when I was deflecting. It was during this learning process for me. Why are you so stingy?
Oh, what a great question.
And I said, what do you mean? And they said, you're totally willing to give, but you aren't willing to receive at all.
So you were stingy with your receiving?
Yeah. I wouldn't let other people give to me.
Yeah, and I remember as I got on top of this issue myself, I would then start helping other people who had the same problem. And I'd remind them, what does it feel like to give? So it's great. Let other people have that opportunity.
Right. Well, and allow other people to be great in how they thank you. These stories, these self-biases, here's something that's kind of interesting. There's a phenomenon called stereotype threat. Interesting term, right? Ooh.
I love these terms you come up with. It makes us sound so smart.
Yeah. Well, we borrow them from smart people. And
they borrowed them from other smart people.
That's right.
Somewhere there's got to be an original smart person.
Well, we'll pretend for the moment that we know them. So the stereotype threat is where unconsciously I know what the social bias is about me. And so I try to do everything I can to not fulfill that stereotype.
But it's unconscious.
Yeah, it's unconscious. It's usually driving my behavior beneath the surface. So, just ask yourself, have you ever pretended to be other than who you are?
Let's see, I think once or twice.
I mean, I grew up doing that a lot. Now, part of it was because I was afraid I was going to get beat up if I didn't. But in less severe situations, I would try to become more of a chameleon, try to fit in, I think is the social term. How can I fit in? Well, basically what we're doing is trying to find our way into something. And imagine if somebody thought that who you are at your core is either dangerous or not smart or whatever. And so the last thing you're going to try to appear extra smart.
Right.
And if the way your people dressed was a particular way, you might dress the way the people are that you're trying to fit into.
It's all defending against something that you've made up inside yourself.
Yeah. So in response to the threat of fulfilling a stereotype, the stereotype threat, people cover is what it's called, right?
Yeah.
They pretend to be who they're not.
Right. It's interesting. I was just working with a marketing person that I've hired, and we were going over a list of pain points, crafting our language. And one of them on there I put was, people feeling like a fraud, that, they're covering up for who they really are. And I, at the moment, was kind of discounting it and putting it down on the list. And she said, well, I think most people feel like that. And we discussed it and realized that in one way or another, a lot of people do feel like they're misrepresenting themselves out of some kind of necessity.
Well, the first time I really became consciously aware of this, I'm sure I had done it a lot, but just wasn't aware of it. I had this amazing boss that I reported to Brilliant guy, creative, wonderful with people. He was just, great. And I looked up to this guy. I mean, he was a real mentor to me. And I remember being in a meeting with him, just me and him one-on-one, prior to going up before the chairman of the board to make a big presentation. And he said, "These times are the hardest for me." And I was like, "Wow, really?" And he went, "Yeah, I'm always afraid that I'm going to be discovered."
He said those words?
Yeah, he said that people will find out that I'm actually a fraud, that I'm not as good as they think I am. Yeah, I mean, here was this guy that, was loved in the industry. People thought highly of him, and secretly, he had this fear of being a fraud.
Well, the real shame of that is that I can imagine him finishing his presentation and getting the biggest reward that he possibly could, given his mindset, "Oh, good, I fooled them again."
Well, yeah,
that would be his highest reward.
Yeah,
to survive a scrutiny.
I don't even know that he was. I think he would have gone, "Oh, whew, they didn't find me out."
Yeah, he's relieved because he wasn't discovered. Exactly.
Yeah, so that was a real eye opener, and I started to look for that now in coaching leaders now, and so on. I know you find the same thing. What we often find is there's a lot of leaders in fairly prominent positions in organizations and communities that have the very same fear, that they're not really up for the task that they've been given.
Well, we promised to get into the how, and I'd like to veer into that for our listeners, give them some practical suggestions. One thing that I do is invite a client to take on another identity for a moment. So I was doing an address the other morning, and the topic was what if, using your imagination to change things, change your life. And I said, okay, I'd like you to introduce yourself to the person next to you as a different person. And so I modeled it. I said, "Hi, my name's Dorothy. I'm a tap dancer from Topeka, Kansas. I'm a single mother and I have 2 children. Glad to meet you." I think I did a little tap dance too, which was just awful. I should stop trying to do things like that. But the point was, and then the group got into it, and it was hilarious. And then I asked them, who's in the room? Brad Pitt was there and so forth. George Clooney was there. There were some women who were very excited about that. But the point was to shift out of the limited identity we claim for ourselves that we then bolster or use to hide who we really are, instead of just being our authentic selves.
Yeah. Well, and part of that is, initially when we're coaching people through this, especially if somebody's hiding something. So I'll give you an example I think a lot of people can relate to. People who are gay in a workplace that's primarily straight are often afraid to show who their family is, because their partner or husband or wife might be same sex.
So this is their secret.
Yeah, so they don't. Everybody else has the picture of their spouse and their kids up on their desk. They don't have anything, And when it comes time for the company picnic or party or whatever, they come alone. And so nobody maybe even knows they have a partner, or sometimes they'll speak of their spouse but not really identify that it's same sex. Yeah. So one of the things we encourage them to do is, first of all, find somebody within the work environment that you feel safe with, and share with them what's going on. And try it out. See, if you choose somebody that is quite accepting and you feel close to, share it with them and see how it goes.
Yeah. You're illustrating a really important principle. It applies to this field, but I think in every kind of change, is to set yourself up for an easy win.
Yes, exactly.
Otherwise described as pick the low-hanging fruit.
Yeah.
Because sometimes we create a challenge for ourselves that is so difficult, we're kind of guaranteed to fail, and then we go, I knew it. I knew I shouldn't have tried to do that. Make it easy. I sometimes say to a person, if they've got 10 things to do and they're stuck, they can't get started, think of 5 things they've already done relating to it, put those on the list and check them off.
Right.
Now they're 1/3 of the way there. They've got momentum.
Yeah,
right? I really appreciate you saying this, because these are challenging things. And, as you were speaking about that, I was trying to get into that, to empathize with what that would be like. And I think that would really be hard. So setting yourself up for an easy first win would seem to be a great idea.
Well, you said something I want to circle back to, because you really got down to the heart of it. So when we talk about biases, and that sometimes they can be about ourselves, and the bias could also be, people won't accept me if they know who I really am. And so if that's a bias, then I've got to be careful, because if I don't pick low-hanging fruit and create some early wins, I will do a self-fulfilling prophecy and prove to myself that people don't accept me, and then I'll continue to pretend to be who I'm not.
Well, would you say that it's accurate that actually part of that bias is unconsciously setting ourselves up to fail to reinforce the validity of the bias?
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. And it happens in so many situations. One other thing, too, that to think about is, as we start to really contemplate that and realize that people are often having far more questions about themselves than we would ever believe. And so, part of overcoming a bias I might have about somebody, and we've mentioned this before, is just try to imagine, what is it about their life that I don't know that might be driving them to be this way?
What a wonderful question. That actually opens the door into compassion.
Yeah, exactly.
Which is walking a mile in someone else's shoes. Just asking the question opens that door.
Well, and there's a little saying, as you say that, I think of, we heard about the golden rule, do unto others as you would have them do to you. There's a take on that some people call it the platinum rule, and some people say that it was actually kind of the deeper intent of the original phrase in Aramaic when Jesus spoke it. But it's do unto others as they would have you do unto them.
Well, now that's a subtle but significant shift.
Yeah.
Say that again.
Do unto others as they would have you do unto them.
Wow, that's very empowering.
Yeah, I have to really start to understand and value what they need and want and who they see themselves as, and not assume that what's good for me is good for them.
Right, and then farther back from that is the standard operating procedure of many people: do unto others before they can do unto you.
We'll catch that in another episode.
Right, Ed, we're actually getting near the end of this one. We always like to have a little something unique at the end of our shows, and this week we looked in our book. And we identified on our Surviving to Thriving guideline 4 elements. We just got time for one. So I'm going to pick the last one here, and I'm going to give us the surviving side, and then maybe you can wrap on the thriving side. Creating stories that reinforce limitations and support an us versus them mentality. So that's surviving. What would thriving be?
Well, thriving, looking at it on the other side, would be creating stories intentionally, right? And openly. In other words, we would share them. I like your what if scenario, that challenge us to be aware of our biases and the divisive dynamics that can occur. And like we talked about with the marketing department, whoever that is on the other side, decide, you know what? I'm going to figure out a way to work with him. I'm going to find the awesomeness in that person or that group and go after it that way. So I intentionally create a story or a mindset that drives my behavior to create a very different outcome than what we're
that sounds
after.
exciting. That sounds like the game you were mentioning. And I'm realizing that much of our program this week has been on self-inquiry. I loved your term, be curious about things. So as a parting shot, what would you advise our listeners to do when they uncover a bias that they weren't aware of? I mean, I love that we get into a game, but there's going to be a moment possibly of real self-judgment as that awareness hits.
Well, the word is instant forgiveness. That just to recognize that this is part of being human. It's part of existing in a culture and a society is, hey, I surfaced a social bias. Wow, I'm vulnerable. So glad I caught that. Even if I caught it after the fact. So glad I can go clean that up now.
Well, in a way, it gets back to our self-acceptance and appreciating ourselves again.
Right. Yeah. What story do I want to make up about myself? Vulnerable doesn't mean bad.
Right.
Right.
And it doesn't mean weak either.
Right. It just means that I'm aware that I have vulnerabilities as a human being, and I'm going to take steps to, head those off at the pass whenever possible.
Wonderful. Well, our time's up, so thanks for joining us again. This is Thriving in Business and in Life, and my name is Will Wilkinson.
And I'm Christopher Harding, and if you have stories or comments, you can send those to thrivinginbusinessandlife@gmail.com. And we'll see you all next week, everyone.
So long.